right, back for the third part of lecture 11, aggregate supply, aggregate demand. Now this has got to be your favorite subject. I mean, there's a lot of other things you can be doing in the summer, but this has got to be up among the most favorite things you do is listen to a lecture on aggregate supply, aggregate demand. We ended last lecture talking about short-run equilibrium, and I mentioned that short-run equilibrium is where the aggregate demand curve intersects a short-run aggregate supply curve. I'm going to introduce now to you a thing called the long-run aggregate supply curve. So the way we model the long-run aggregate supply is we show it as a vertical line coming up from the real GDP axis, and where it comes out of real GDP is either what we call the level of real GDP at the natural rate of unemployment, that's what I mean by QNR, or the full employment level of output. So these two things are pretty wordy, I realize that, but the idea is this. There's some level of output that the economy is capable of producing when we're at full employment. Remember from going over unemployment that full employment doesn't mean that everybody has a job. It just means that we're at a thing called the natural rate of unemployment. That's when we have maybe only frictional unemployed people and maybe some structural unemployment depending on what's taking place, but we don't have any cyclical unemployment. So we're at full employment, and there's some amount of goods and services that the economy can produce when we're at full employment. You could think of that as, and we'll bring in the production possibility frontier model later on. You could think of that as being on our, or at least one of our production possibility frontiers, and I'll explain that later on, okay? So that's our long-run average supply curve. If the long-run average supply curve intersects the aggregate demand curve at the same place that the short-run average supply curve intersects the aggregate demand curve, then the economy is in equilibrium in the short run and the long run at the same level of GDP and at that price level. So this is ideally where we'd like the economy to be. We'd like the short run level, short run equilibrium to be identical to the long run equilibrium. This means that the economy is humming along at full employment or the natural rate of unemployment, and we're fully utilizing as many resources as we can. In other words, we're not producing less than we're capable, and we're also not producing more for short periods of time than we're capable, and I'll get into that a little bit more as the lecture progresses. So this is what we mean by long-run, short-run equilibrium. All right, another point I want to bring up about this model is that some economists have different views as to what the short-run average supply curve looks like. So one school of economic thought is that the short-run aggregate supply curve is a horizontal line until we get to the natural rate of unemployment or the level of output at the natural rate of unemployment, and then we transition on to the long-run average supply curve. Other economists say, well, maybe the short-run average supply curve is horizontal, but as we get closer and closer to the full employment level of output, or how much we can produce when we're at the natural rate of unemployment, the short-run average supply curve becomes upward sloping. Now, why does this matter? It matters because if your view of the world is that the short-run average supply curve is a horizontal line, and let's say we're over here at Q2, so we're below the full employment level of output, and we think that if we get some increase in aggregate demand, maybe, some more government spending or something like that, that would shift the aggregate demand curve so that we're over here on AD3, then we will get to the full employment level of output without seeing any inflation. In other words, we will have moved from an equilibrium level of GDP of Q2 to an equilibrium level of GDP of QNR. All right, but if your view of the world is that the short-run average supply curve starts sloping upwards as we get closer and closer to the full employment level of output, then this shift in aggregate demand will not get us to the full employment level of output, or QNR. It might lead to a situation like this where we're over here at Q3 and prices have gone up as well. So if the goal is to get us to QNR, or the full employment level of output, then we would need one more shift in the aggregate demand curve to get us there. And even if we got to QNR, we'd probably be at a higher price level. Does that make sense? So this is why I bring this up because you may see I don't know how many of you want to major in economics, but you may see different ways in which the short run aggregate supply curve is represented. In this class, we're going to assume that the short run aggregate supply curve is upward sloping. All right, so how can we combine this model, our aggregate supply aggregate demand model, with a model that you've been exposed to before at the beginning of the class and also in maybe economics classes you might have had in high school. So think of being on the short run average supply curve, but below the full employment level of output as being inside of our production possibility frontier. Also think of us traveling along the short run aggregate supply curve and approaching the full employment level of output. So from left to right, we're moving along the short run aggregate supply curve. Maybe it starts becoming upward sloping. That would be like moving closer and closer to our production possibility frontier. I'm going to throw a curve at you in a little while and actually tell you that there's more than one production possibility frontier, but bear with me nonetheless. The first thing I want to do, though, is go over what happens when we have shifts in either the aggregate demand curve or the short run aggregate supply curve. So again, assuming we have an upward sloping short run aggregate supply curve, an increase in aggregate demand according to this would lead to higher levels of real GDP, but the economy might experience an increase in the price level, which is essentially a little bit of inflation, right? If, on the other hand, the aggregate demand curve shifted to the left, we would have lower levels of real GDP and we'd have deflation. Now, this type of deflation, later on we'll talk about different types of deflation, maybe not today, but when we get to monetary policy, this is not the type of deflation we would like to see. This deflation is being caused by insufficient aggregate demand, and if it were to persist for too long, it might lead to a further downward spiral in the economy. So I know it sounds good to see prices go down, but it could actually have negative long-term effects. So just keep that in mind. Okay, if the short-run average supply curve shifted to the right, this would lead to higher levels of real GDP and also deflation. Now, this deflation isn't as bad as the previous deflation because it's happening because we're becoming more efficient at producing things. In other words, it's not because we have a shortage of aggregate demand and people don't have money to buy things. It's because we've maybe developed some technology that helps us out, helps us produce more, and as a result, in a competitive market, maybe we'll see prices going down. All right, if on the other hand, the short run average supply curve shifted to the left, that's what we call an adverse supply shock. That might be caused by a restraint in a commodity or something that we need to produce more goods. As a result, what would we see? We'd see lower real GDP and an increase in the price level. This actually happened twice in the 1970s. We were embargoed to oil in 1973. And then again in 1979, we stopped buying oil from Iran because they took our people hostage. Both those things led to big increases in the price of oil, which ultimately oil is used in the production of all goods. That fed through the economy. And so both times we went into recession, and both times we saw prices go up, which is unusual during a recession. Usually prices go down when the economy goes into recession. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the recessionary gap. The recessionary gap is when the short run level of output, I'm going to call that QR, is less than we would be when we're at full employment. So remember, we're saying that QNR represents the amount of goods and services we can produce when we're at the natural rate of unemployment. But for some reason, the economy is stuck over here at QR. This is where the aggregate demand curve intersects our short run aggregate supply curve. If we could only move the aggregate demand curve to the right a little bit, then maybe we would get to the full employment level of output. Might mean a little bit of inflation, but at least we'd be closer to what the economy's potential is. All right, let's say we're in the inflationary gap. So why is this the inflationary gap? It's called the inflationary gap because the short run equilibrium level of GDP is higher than the long run equilibrium level of GDP. We're in an economic boom. People are making money, or they think they're making money. They're busy. Workers are getting paid overtime to work even more hours. The aggregate demand curve shifted from its long-run, short-run equilibrium to something like this. What's happened in the process? In the process, we've seen a higher level of real GDP, and we've seen an increase in the price level. And later on, if nothing is done, we'll get into that a little bit later when we get into money and banking, but what will probably happen is a short run aggregate supply curve will shift to the left for reasons that have to do with the increases in prices, and we'll talk about that later. All right, so what do we mean by increases in prices? Essentially, we mean inflation. So if you think back to the discussion that we had about inflation back in, I think it was lecture 9 or lecture 10. When we have an increase in the price level, we can calculate inflation by looking at the change in the CPI, right? The percentage change in the CPI. So if we're seeing the price level go up and up and up, then that indicates that we're probably seeing inflation, especially if the rate of inflation continues going up and up and up. So that's what I mean by that. All right, let's see. Long run equilibrium. So let's talk a little bit about what happens when we get to the long run equilibrium and how the economy can be in an economic boom. So imagine we're over here this is our equilibrium over here, ESR1. So we're Q1 is a level of real GDP, PL1 is a price level. Imagine that we get an increase in aggregate demand. Imagine that as a result of this increase in aggregate demand, we go over here to Q2. And because our short-run aggregate supply curve is upward sloping, we also see an increase in the price level. What would that look like on our production possibility frontier model? Well, it would look like we're moving closer and closer to one of our production possibility frontiers, one that I'm going to call the institutional production possibility frontier. Just bear with me. I'll explain what I mean by an institutional production possibility frontier, and I'll also bring in a thing called the physical production possibility frontier. So we're not quite at the long-run aggregate supply curve. We're not quite at the full employment level of output, and which means that we're still within our institutional production possibility frontier. Okay, imagine now that we get another increase in aggregate demand. We go from Q2 and PL2 over here to QNR and whatever this price level happens to be over here. Now our short-run equilibrium is equal to our long-run equilibrium. In other words, this is where we wanted the economy to be all along. What would that look like in production possibility frontier land? It would look like we're on our institutional production possibility frontier. However, we know that the economy can go into an economic boom. In other words, we can be operating to the right of QNR, and that would mean that we'd be operating beyond our institutional production possibility frontier. So that brings up the question of what is the difference between our institutional production possibility frontier and our physical production possibility frontier. The institutional production possibility frontier is the amount of goods and services that the economy can produce when it's fully utilizing all its resources under the institutional constraints that exist. So what do we mean by that? Institutional constraints that come to mind would be something like, what is full-time employment? In the modern economy, full-time employment is 40 hours a week, 50 weeks a year. Is it possible to work more than 40 hours a week? And the answer is yes. But in the modern economy, if an employer wants to work his workers more than that, he's got to pay them time and a half. They have to agree to it, and he's got to pay them time and a half. So it's possible that when we get into an economic boom, the aggregate demand curve might shift one more time, and over here now Q4 is the level of output and PL4 is the price level. We've entered the inflationary gap or an economic boom. We're beyond our institutional production possibility frontier. But one thing we can never go beyond is a physical production possibility frontier. In other words, it's possible for us to work more hours. It's possible for us to work ourselves to death. But there's some physical limitation as to how many hours or how much we can produce based on, I don't know, working 60 or 70 or 80 hours a week. I mean, we certainly can't work more than 168 hours a week or anything like that. So when we're in an economic boom, we might be over here at Q4 and PL4 on our aggregate supply aggregate demand model, which is equivalent to being beyond our institutional production possibility frontier, but not our physical production possibility frontier. Does that make sense? All right, I'm going to end it here, folks. I know you're riveted by these lectures. But come back for lecture 4 for the last one. Thanks a lot.